So strange when you look into history and you find out exactly how, well, certain people may have offended, of course, our British monarchy. When you look back years ago, maybe in the court of Henry VIII, it didn't take too much, did it, to offend His Majesty the King? And you know how, well, unhappy that could end. Of course, still things went along way on into history. And you think about, say, how Wallis Simpson didn't like particular servants, and of course they were no longer required to serve her, that sort of stuff. If you also remember when Wallis went shopping in London, there were certain people that weren't allowed to serve her unless, of course, they gave her the courteous reply that she was simply looking for. You get the picture. But moving forward, what was fascinating about this particular story is exactly how this Hollywood legend, well, literally took a turn for the worse with the British monarchy. Let me explain. Lovely to see you today on this wet and wild day over here in the United Kingdom, but it's always good to get out in the air. I've got to tell you, it's in double figures, you know, the temperature right now. Isn't it strange wherever we are, you know? But of course, let's not mention that. We'll have a certain person on our backs, you know the one I mean, now grown up, making a nuisance of herself, but you get the picture. I don't know about you, I always loved that thing where the president at the time, Donald Trump, walked past her. You know the one I mean, the picture, and just totally ignored her. I think as anybody would with a child that's been a little bit petulant. And it's funny, isn't it, how time shows, well, how right he was to do that in many respects. Always fascinating. But were the royals right to do this with this particular Hollywood star? This, of course, is the brilliant George Raft. Now, I loved George Raft movies. I don't know about you, I don't think there's a bad one. And when you watch him, he had a certain sort of style and pizzazz, didn't he? I know it was the era with the great trilbies and the trench coats and all that sort of stuff, but he also looked menacing too. But according to Tony Curtis, who co-starred with him in the 1959 brilliant movie Some Like It Hot, apparently behind the scenes he was a softie who loved musical theatre, and his dream really was to become a more successful dancer than Fred Astaire. But he went down a different route. Casting directors decided that he looked menacing, and that's the reason how he got all of those roles in those marvellous RKO movies. Great to know though, isn't it? You know, this sort of thing. I just find that sort of stuff fascinating. Tony Curtis said afterwards that George Raft in fact taught him to tap dance in between scenes because they were waiting around so long for the star of the show, Marilyn Monroe. But as ever, whenever I get round to it, all of those stories will come out in my book. Now let's get back to this story, because this really was George Raft trying to make a comeback in the middle 60s. Things were looking a little bit bleak, as they were for many Hollywood legends at that point, and he'd set up his own club over here in the United Kingdom. But then what emerged was that there were certain unsavoury aspects attached to that club. People like this. That's right, the infamous Kray twins. Now, where it got interesting with the Kray twins were, they just loved to be pictured with celebrities, and more importantly, politicians and high-flying figures. Now, they claim that they just love meeting celebrities. Insiders told me that no, it was really a case of control, because once they decided that you were going to do what they wanted, they had the picture, you understand. Now, George Raft was very clever and very shrewd, but even he fell for it and managed to get pictured with them. And allegedly they backed his club, which really was part of his downfall over here in the United Kingdom. But moving forward, what was fascinating was George had decided that he too, having spoken to his friends like Frank Sinatra and Bob Hope, should actually appear in one of our Royal Variety performances. Why not? Now, he'd already met Princess Margaret at a club in literally Irving Street off Leicester Square. And this was a late night drinking club that she apparently frequented on a regular basis. And apparently they got on so well, and she had no idea that he had a career as a dancer, and said, well, you know, I'm sure they would love to have you. So obviously the contacts were made. And sadly for him, the people that put the Royal Variety together at that time were the likes of Robert Nesbitt and of course Lord Bernie Delfont, alongside Val Parnell. Now, again, where it gets interesting is this, because they quite liked the idea, but then they looked into the picture background and they said, well, what about this? And he said, oh, they're just friends. But at the time, the Krays were known as the most menacing gangster gang inside London, absolutely terrifying the East End and West End, right? So they simply couldn't book George, but he didn't want to know. He felt that he could offer something very spectacular for, of course, the royal party. Now, moving forward, where it got even more fascinating is he was told, well, look, come along to the theatre, blah, blah, blah. But really what happened was he never got on because they said, look, it's just too risky, we can't do it, and everybody's decided that no, this wouldn't be the right sort of look to present in front of the British monarchy. So in order to placate him, because apparently, according to sources, George could turn pretty difficult too, right? They decided to, well, offer him a slot on their much highly rated Sunday night at the London Palladium, of which he did, according to my good friend Lionel Blair, alongside the British comedian Jimmy Tarbuck. And that's the reason why he was promoting the club, which was allegedly backed by the Krays, and then popping up on Sunday night at the Palladium to let people know he was in town and also available for work. And let's not forget, not a bad tap dancer and hoofer too. And that's the story of how George Raft failed to get in front of British royalty at a royal variety show. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.